Hello everyone, we should get started. It's wonderful seeing such a great turnout during the last week of the semester. This is our last Feminist Research Alliance workshop of the academic year, so it's great to see all of you here. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Matthew Sommer, Professor of Chinese History at Stanford. His research focuses on sexuality, gender, and law in the Qing dynasty, which goes from 1644 to 1912. And I thought I did a lot by the long 19th century. You actually do 3 centuries. His first book is entitled Sex, Law, and Society in Late Imperial China. And his second book, Polyandry and Wife Selling in Qing Dynasty China, was the subject of his fascinating talk. Many of you were there yesterday afternoon. And Professor Sommer's focus is not on the elites of Chinese society, but the other end of the class spectrum, on the much larger group of rural peasants. And what I found most intriguing, this is connected to the topic of today's talk, is his definition of the Chinese family structure, which is not the nuclear family of romantic love and consensual choice and all that, but the family structure was designed to solve problems. And that's actually a quote from your talk. And it had to be flexible and pragmatic to grapple with the issues of poverty, widowhood, and a host of other matters. So today's talk stems in part from an article that he published on abortion in late Imperial China that is available still on our website if you'd like to check it out. And the title of today's talk is Abortion as a Topic for Feminist Historical Research, The Case of China. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sommer to the Gender Institute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you to my other hosts. So this is a project that began with my curiosity about some claims that other historians had made, which I at first had accepted as face value because I respected these people. But then I became curious and tried to dig a little further to see what the basis was for their claims. I'll start by talking a bit about this. These are 4 kinds of insects. At the top you have banmao, da banmao, xiao banmao. This is the insect malabris, kind of beetle. And then on the lower left you have a kind of cicada called weches, hong yang chong, which means the bride insect because it's red like a bride. And then Lita on the lower right, this is called qin yang chong, the green lady or blue lady, another kind of beetle. The beetles are related to the notorious Spanish fly, which you may have heard of, which is a kind of blister beetle found in other parts of the world. These are called blister beetles because in traditional Western and Chinese medicine, they could be used as vesicants to burn, using the chemicals to burn the skin, like to remove warts or to treat scrofula or things like that. These insects contain a chemical called cantharidin, banmao su in Chinese, which is extremely caustic. It's like, I don't know if it's acid or base, what it is, but it will burn your skin, burns the flesh. And therefore it can be used, if used with caution, very effectively in dermatology for some conditions. These are among the best known traditional drugs that were used for trying to induce abortion in late Imperial China. And if you look at the classic pharmacopoeia, like the Wencao Gangmu by Li Shizhen, it says that these drugs can be used when taken orally or used in vaginal suppositories. They can be used to treat amenorrhea, to hasten labor, to bring down retained placenta, to induce abortion, to expel a dead fetus. And when you look at the abortifacient recipes in these classic pharmacopoeia, and right down in the 20th century, these insects figure very prominently in them. There is also a very strong belief that these can be used to cure cancer or to treat rabies. And so the classic recipe, the classic prescription for treating you if you've been bitten by a rabid dog was various concoctions made with these insect drugs. It was believed traditionally, and you see this in these authoritative pharmacopoeia, that when a rabid dog bites someone, that person has been, in a sense, impregnated with tiny dog fetuses. There are different versions of the story. And therefore, if you take the drugs made with these insects, you will pass in the urine blood clots that are shaped like little dogs, and those are the dog fetuses. And you have to keep taking the medicine until you stop passing those blood clots, and then you're cured. These things, the cantharidin, the active ingredient, it causes kidney failure. It also causes terrible internal chemical burns throughout the alimentary canal and the urinary tract. And even a tiny dose is fatal if it's taken internally. This is what cantharidin does to the skin. So if you take one of these beetles and you rub it on your skin, that's what happens. And it's, if you look at the beautiful colors and bright patterns, this is a good example of worn-in coloring in nature. I mean, you may be familiar with like the poison dart frogs in the Amazon, they're bright red. This is nature's way of saying, don't eat me, I am poisonous. Right? And so this is a good example of that kind of signaling in nature. So, in fact, there is no laboratory or clinical evidence whatsoever that these insect drugs are effective for inducing abortion or treating rabies. And so the idea of why is it good for treating rabies? Because in effect it's inducing an abortion and causing these dog fetuses to be passed in the urine. And so it links to the idea that this could be, basically it will cause bleeding. The reason why Spanish fly, close relative with the same chemical in it, was thought to be an aphrodisiac is that one of the symptoms of this kind of poisoning in men is priapism, because the entire urinary tract is highly irritated. And so because of this, apparently this sort of folk legend became widespread that taking this would cause sexual prowess. It's actually extremely dangerous. If a man gets priapism because of this, he's likely to die very quickly. So don't take Spanish fly. So there's no clinical or laboratory evidence whatsoever that these insect drugs are effective for inducing abortion or treating rabies. There's no safe dose for internal use. 1.5 grams of the powdered Malabris beetle, the one with the stripes, which is the most dangerous. 1.5 grams taken internally will kill you. Nevertheless, even in China today, there persists this very widespread folk belief that these insects can be used to induce abortion, can prevent the onset of rabies if you've been bitten by a rabid dog, and can cure cancer. And so, as a result, poisoning and even death by these insects remains a real problem, especially in rural areas that are relatively backward economically. And it's not just a folk belief. I was just checking the other day when I was thinking about this presentation, and I found websites in China and Chinese talking about these drugs, marketing these drugs online, and kind of infusions made with these insects, and marketing as cures for rabies and as cancer treatments. So this is alive and well, this kind of belief system. And there are plenty of accounts, if you look online, database searches of medical journals, forensic pathology journals, and there are plenty of reports of people being given emergency treatment or dying despite emergency treatment because of poisoning with these drugs. So how did I get interested in this topic? I have no background in entomology. I didn't know anything about this stuff until I started doing research about it. As I mentioned at the outset, I was aware that there were two sets of historians, demographic historians and gender historians, who in different ways, for different purposes, had argued that at least some people in late Imperial China used abortion for routine birth control. And when I first read these things, I just sort of took it at face value and assumed it must be right. But then, for reasons I'll get into in a moment, I started to become a little bit skeptical and I started pushing a little further. So first of all, let me outline the past scholarship, the basic view. So the demographic historians, and here I'm talking about James Li, Li Bozhong, and Wang Feng, primarily. Those three are the most important. Some of you may know their work. They claim that fertility rates in late Imperial China were so low, they were as low or even lower than those in early modern England, that they cannot be explained without widespread and systematic birth control to limit family size. On this basis, they argue that the Chinese demographic regime has long been characterized by birth control, rational family planning, in which abortion played a prominent role, along with marital restraint, contraception, and infanticide. They see all of these things as a package of family planning techniques, birth control techniques. Moreover, they claim there was no moral stigma associated with infanticide. In a book by James Li and Wang Feng called 1/4 of Humanity, they say that the Chinese never disapproved of infanticide. It's a rather sweeping statement, the Chinese. How many billion people are you talking about over the last couple thousand years? And therefore, they say that infanticide should be considered a form of birth control. In one controversial article, they referred to it as postnatal abortion, in quotation marks. And therefore, they say that infanticide should not be counted in the birth rate or in the death rate. And it's one of the ways that they bring the birth rate down so it looks comparable to the early modern England. This is controversial for reasons that must be obvious. The whole notion of postnatal abortion blurs the boundaries between abortion and infanticide in ways that are quite familiar from those who know the politics of this issue in the United States today. So I wonder about the politics of that kind of historical analysis. Anyway, the demographic historians argue that since, again, another controversial aspect, they argue that since the Chinese people have long practiced rational family planning, they've done this for centuries, there was no reason, no need for China to undergo a modern demographic transition away from natural fertility like that the West underwent in the early modern and modern eras. Indeed, they say it was a simple and seamless process for people in China to adapt their own long-standing practice of birth control to the post-Mao state's new regime of population control. Therefore, they say this is a seamless, smooth process without controversy or opposition. Now, that's simply false, as I think those of you familiar with these issues in China will know. But they blithely make these claims. In fact, they make claims in their work that I think if they were not Chinese, they'd be accused of racism. Quite frankly, they can get away with some of this because they're Chinese. So that's the demographic historians. I'll be talking more about the gender historians today. I think they're probably more pertinent to what we're talking about here today. But so in the demographic regime, supposedly abortion was part of this package of techniques. Now the gender historians, here I'm talking about primarily Francesca Bray and Charlotte Firth, and these are two historians who've made great contributions, who I respect greatly. I have problems with this particular aspect of their work, but I want to make clear that I have great admiration and respect for them more broadly in terms of their contributions. They focus on elite women, and they look at the big elite family, which had polygyny as the basic marriage practice. I talked a little bit about polygyny yesterday. For those of you who weren't there, in polygyny you have one husband with one main wife, herself from an elite background, and then you had concubines and maidservants who were also sexually available to the husband. And the concubines and maidservants had a very subordinate status in the household. They were, I mean, the concubines in particular, they were a kind of legitimate secondary spouse, legitimate in the sense that their children were legitimate, their sons inherited equally, and as long as they behaved themselves according to the norms of the time, they had an honorable position in their household and in society. So it was not like having a mistress or something like that. Right? Nevertheless, they had a very subordinate role, and they were bought on the market for the going rate from their families. They came from poor backgrounds. The main wife, however, was herself an elite woman. In the Qing, she would have been literate, highly educated. She would come in with dowry in an alliance arranged between two elite families.
Can I just interject here for the students in my class?
Yes.
That's Lady Shun. So they read this little article from Susan Mann's book.
Oh, great, okay.
And about the life of Lady Shun. So she's from elite background, she's educated, just to put that in place, because quite a few people here are in my class.
So, thank you. So the gender historians, Francesca Bray and Charlotte Firth, focus on this kind of household and on the division of labor between the women in this kind of household. What they argue is that there was this division of labor among the women in which the elite wife could monopolize the social and ritual aspects of motherhood. Basically, all of her husband's children were legally and ritually her children, and she would monopolize their upbringing, their education, their care, and so on. But the biological duties of motherhood, having sex, getting pregnant, giving birth, breastfeeding, all that stuff, this could be foisted onto these subordinate women who had no say in that. And so the argument goes like this, that elite wives were able to use drugs, these were abortifacient medicines, that they euphemized as medicines to unblock menstruation, 通经药, which is a medicine to unblock menstruation, to open it up. They would use these drugs to terminate early pregnancies, which were euphemized as menstrual blockage, because it was widely known and believed that regular menstruation was seen as a foundation of a woman's health and her fertility. And this technology, which they believe that this was a technology of reproductive control, enabled elite wives to avoid childbearing if they wanted to. In other words, while they were monopolizing the social and ritual aspects of motherhood, and they were having sex lives with their husbands, they could avoid childbearing and push that stuff off onto the subordinate women in the household, who had no choice but to put up with it. In other words, according to this argument, at least some women in the society enjoyed a remarkable degree of agency and autonomy in their reproductive lives, although it was at the cost of exploiting other women. And this is an aspect of the kind of class exploitation within the elite household that I mentioned yesterday also. So that's the argument that the gender historians make. Now, despite their differences, both sets of historians believe that at least some people were using abortion as part of routine birth control. This belief seems to presuppose that, let's see, switch here, that traditional methods of abortion, and actually in the case of the demographers, herbal concoctions used for contraception as well, they believe that these were safe, they were effective, and they were readily available to people who wished to use them. That's the common point, the common premise between these schools of thought. Now, different aspects of these arguments are controversial, especially the demographers, and I don't want to belabor that point. But I had not paid much specific attention to this matter, and especially the gender historians. I simply assumed that they were right, and I took this face value. I used these books in my teaching. I had taught this many, many times, so I was very familiar with the argument. But in the course of my research on other matters in the Qing legal archives, I consistently came across two kinds of legal cases that just didn't seem to fit this picture. Somehow it just didn't seem to fit. Both of these kinds of cases involved women who had gotten pregnant by adultery. So these were widows, these were unmarried women, these were Buddhist nuns, these were wives whose husbands were away for a long, long time. They got pregnant by adultery, and some of these cases documented actual attempts at abortion in which women died after taking the abortifacient drugs. Many others, a far larger category, maybe 10 or 20 times as many, documented pregnancies that were carried to term despite the disastrous consequences for the women of doing so. And some of those women had attempted to secure means of abortion, but they failed. Others had attempted abortion, but got really sick, and then the abortion failed. Still others committed infanticide after giving birth, trying to cover up what had happened, but they were exposed anyway. And so the more of these kinds of cases I saw, the more curious and skeptical I became about what these previous scholars had said. I think the problem is obvious, right? If in fact effective contraception and or abortion were readily available, they were widely used, if they were effective and safe enough for regular use, then why did these women end up in such dire straits? Why did the women in the first group of cases who did take abortifacients end up dead? And why didn't the second group of women save themselves by terminating their pregnancies so that nobody would be the wiser? So I became skeptical about this. And so I started to look further. And there were three basic strategies. And at first this was not a concrete plan. I was just curious, and so I started checking the footnotes of these people. That's what footnotes are for, right? That's what they're supposed to be for. So I looked up the primary sources they had cited. It turned out, first of all, the demographic historians basically had no sources. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. They had no sources, so we can set that aside for the moment. With the gender historians, they had interesting sources, but when I read the original in Chinese, the sources did not support their argument. But anyway, that was the first strategy, to check the sources they had used. Then, when I realized I was not satisfied with the source base that they had used, I decided to try to look more systematically into these legal sources, which none of them had looked at. Right? Both cases and also legal codes and commentaries, these kinds of things. I have to say, I wish I had been more attentive, because I saw lots and lots and lots of relevant cases that I did not bother to copy. It was only after I started noticing and paying attention that I started to copy something. So I ended up with a sample of cases, but I have seen many, many more that I don't have copies of. So this was the second strategy. And the third strategy, it occurred to me that, if there were safe and effective and readily available methods of abortion available traditionally, using herbs and insects and whatever, if those existed in traditional times, then they should still exist. Because after all, since 1949, the Communist government of China has energetically promoted traditional Chinese medicine for reasons of economic autarky, but also for ideological reasons. This is something that China is very proud of. And there's this vast institutionalized apparatus for traditional Chinese medicine in China. So there's that reason. But then also, of course, since the 1970s, the Chinese government has pushed population control, including widespread and often compulsory abortion, right? And so it seemed to me, it stood to reason that if these techniques had been available, then they should still be available. They should be very well known. They should be widely used. And so I decided to investigate that too. So these are my three approaches. I don't want to go into too much detail. I really want to keep this in under half an hour so we can have a conversation. To avoid misunderstanding, I should say that I agree with past scholarship on a couple of points. I agree that there are a number of supposed methods of abortion that were known, the most important by far being these abortifacient drugs, including the insects I talked about. I also agree that at least some of these methods worked as intended, at least some of the time. Where I disagree, and the conclusion I really came to, has to do with the safety, efficacy, and availability of these methods of abortion. I believe that these drugs were extremely dangerous, they were extremely unreliable, that access to them and their use required specialized knowledge, and that they often required a fair amount of money, enough money so that for ordinary people it would probably be a big stretch to pay for this. And so under the circumstances, abortion constituted neither an effective means of birth control, nor a tool for female empowerment, as these past scholars have envisioned. So that's the conclusion I came to. On the contrary, I believe that abortion, when it was attempted, was an emergency intervention in a crisis. There are two kinds of crises. The first is a medical crisis, when a woman's life was believed in danger by her pregnancy, and so it was believed urgent to try to terminate the pregnancy to save her life. And that's the kind of scenario, that kind of therapeutic abortion is what you see in these medical texts that the gender historians have relied on. Medical texts written by elite male literati physicians. The second kind of crisis was the one caused by adultery, right? Where it was essentially a kind of social crisis in nature, where if a woman's extramarital sexual behavior was exposed, then she was likely to get in big trouble. And so those are the two kinds of scenarios in which I can find evidence of this actually going on. I can find no evidence of any kind to support the claims of either set of historian. In fact, one of the problems is that none of them have provided even a single documented example of anyone using abortion in the manner that they suggest. And so it's a big problem, it seems to me. It's very hard to claim a widespread social practice on the basis of no sources. So anyway, if we look back at, I think I skipped it. Look at the sources they've used. So the first is these traditional Encyclopedias of Materia Medica. I already mentioned the Bunsal Kanmu. This is the most famous, but there are many in this genre from the Ming and the Qing dynasty. If you look at these, indeed, you can find these lists of drugs that supposedly can be used to hasten labor, induce abortion, bring down the retained placenta, etc., treat amenorrhea. This is the most famous. These lists include things like human blood, human urine, liquid mercury, many toxic herbs, including very dangerous ones that contain aconite and strychnine, scorpions, many toxic insects, including the ones that I showed you at the beginning. And so what do we make of this? Past historians have tended to look at these and kind of take them at face value. They never mention like the human urine, for example, but they will look at the other drugs and assume that these must have worked. In fact, I had a colleague who will go unnamed say to me that women are not stupid. They wouldn't have used these things if they didn't work. And then I think about all the things that women used in the United States before Roe versus Wade. They would douche with bleach, they would douche with lye. I mean, the fact that people believe something is not proof that it is true, right? I think we can all agree on that. And so, you look at these lists of drugs, I think what it shows you is that the elite male authors of these pharmacopoeia may have believed that these would work, but it doesn't prove that they worked, nor does it prove that anyone's actually using them for the purposes described, right? You can't just assume that based on these lists. Then demographic historians, James Lee and company, have used quantitative data they've extracted from various population records, mainly banner registers from Manchuria. There are a lot of problems with those sources, and there are a lot of problems with the way they collected data from those sources. I can go into that later if anyone's really interested. But basically what they claim is that their numbers prove there must have been this widespread birth control. And then they kind of throw everything against the wall to see what sticks. And it turns out nothing really sticks if you look at their sources. So all they've got is their numbers, and their numbers are highly dubious. And quite frankly, if they cannot be relied on to cite secondary sources accurately, I don't see any reason why we should believe them when they cite these obscure and complicated archival sources that nobody else has access to. So that's just my own position about them. I believe actually their work is dishonest, and a lot of fundamental ethical problems about the research. I'll just say that. Okay, I would not say that about the gender historians. Most of their work I think is solid, and I have great respect with them, even though I disagree on this point. But basically, given the problems of any quantitative data for China before the 20th century, I think it's essential that arguments be based primarily on qualitative evidence. Qualitative evidence should be decisive. So quantitative arguments can be made if you're careful, but they're convincing to me only if there is robust qualitative evidence that conforms to them, that supports them. If the qualitative evidence is not there, or if it contradicts the numbers, then I think we should just not trust the numbers, because there's so many problems with this kind of data from the pre-20th century in China. So, really, the gender historians, as I mentioned, they rely almost completely on these medical case books and these other medical books by elite male literati physicians, in which they talk about cases which they treated that either went well or didn't go well. They uniformly portray abortion as an emergency measure in a medical crisis when a woman's life is in danger. That's how they portray it. And they portray this, they're very explicit, this is a very, very risky business, but it's justified if the woman's going to die. Therefore, you try it to see if this might save her. But they're very explicit about the risks involved. And they constantly warn of the danger and potential lethality of abortifacient drugs. And they give examples of women who became severely ill or died after taking them. And so, one of the problems that I have with the gender historians is that if you read this medical discourse, it just seems to contradict the argument they make, right? That elite women were using these things essentially as sort of a routine birth control practice. So that's a basic problem with Bray and Firth, but they don't really ever attempt to resolve this contradiction. They also rest their argument on an ambiguity between what was called menstrual regulation and abortion. If you look at the drugs that were used for menstrual regulation, there is, it's like a Venn diagram. There is some overlap with the drugs that were used for abortion. But I am suspicious that there was really as much ambiguity in practice as they believe, or they claim. In fact, their claim seems to suggest that the women themselves knew they were pregnant, but this is represented to everyone as menstrual blockage. Right? Therefore, they could get away with using these drugs for abortion because it would be interpreted as unblocking the menstruation. But in practice, to the extent you can find dosages, the dosage of an individual drug seems to have varied very dramatically depending on the use. So the dosages for abortion were big doses. One reason they were so dangerous. The doses for Tongjingyao were like tiny, tiny amounts. And you can see this in Europe and America too, if you look at the early modern era. Herbs like tansy, which are highly toxic, would be used in tiny, tiny amounts by women to make their menstruation regular. Basically, these drugs make women bleed. It's not clearly that's menstruating when they're bleeding, but they're bleeding, so that was interpreted as menstruation. A large dose of tansy, though, which might be used to induce abortion, could kill you. It could cause seizures and neurological damage, and it might well kill you. And there are plenty of documented cases of that in 19th century America. So this question of dosage is key, it seems, and yet the gender historians never really address that. They dwell on the ambiguity. But again, there's a problem with the ambiguity because it's all very ambiguous and there are no documented examples of anyone doing this, so it seems to me that it remains a kind of speculation. Speculation I find hard to accept. I think the burden of the evidence is really against this. But also, the division of labor that they talk about between social and biological motherhood, monopolized by the elite wife, and then the biological stuff, social and ritual, and then the biological stuff which is foisted on the concubines and the maids, I think that's perfectly plausible. And I don't think it requires that wives use these toxic drugs for fertility control. There are many, many documented examples, which Firth and Bray actually acknowledge some of, in which an elite wife who didn't want to sleep with her husband anymore would buy him a concubine. You know, I mean, what better way? If you don't want to
Lady Shun did that, if you may recall.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you don't want to deal with the biological messiness anymore, and after all, these are arranged marriages, these women don't necessarily want to sleep with their husbands in the first place, right? Best way to do it, right, is just to use your pocket money, buy an attractive surrogate, give her to your husband, and then he leaves you alone. Right? I mean, this is not rocket science, I think. We're talking about the polygynous elite household, and this sort of thing went on all the time. And it seems to me that that's a much better way to handle this division of labor than dosing yourself with those beetles, for God's sake, and risking your life. And the fact is there are many documented examples of wives getting concubines for their husbands. That we know happened. This other stuff is speculation. So that's so much for the evidence they provided. So then I looked at the legal cases. I don't want to go into this much longer because we're going to run out of time here. But basically what the legal cases show is several things. If we look at the law, they do talk about abortion, but law, in the legal texts, it's always portrayed as something that is caused by the crisis of adultery. The abortifacients are portrayed as extremely dangerous, if not lethal. And to the extent this is prosecuted and focused on an individual who provided an abortifacient to a pregnant woman who was pregnant by adultery and then who died after taking the drugs. And then the accomplice to this would be prosecuted under a category of homicide law, for, by analogy to the law against knowingly providing poison for purpose of homicide. So, the abortifacient is analogized to poison, and the woman's death is seen as a kind of homicide, maybe by negligence, because people should know that these things are so dangerous. That's the way it's portrayed in the law and the commentaries. And there's really no ambiguity about it in the legal texts. And so here's a very important jurist from the 18th century, a very experienced guy. The drugs used to induce abortion are all extraordinarily harsh in nature, so that even 1 out of 10 women who suffer their effects may not survive. In this scenario, although the adulteress's misfortune is of her own making, the man with whom she had adultery first ruined her chastity, then took her life by providing the drugs. So it would be inappropriate to let him off lightly by sentencing only for his crime of adultery. Therefore, he is liable for her death as a kind of homicide, negligent homicide. And then if you look at the legal cases, as I mentioned, there are these 2 basic categories. One is women attempting abortion and dying of poisoning. Sometimes they succeed in aborting, often they do not, but they end up dead. And then there's this much larger category of women who carried pregnancies to term, even though it was extremely inconvenient to do so. But they apparently had no other choice in the matter. And it's interesting because some of those cases show women who actually tried desperately to obtain means of abortion. They couldn't get them. And they had money somewhere. They couldn't get them. They simply were not that readily available. And also, so these are just a couple of scenarios from legal cases in which a widow becomes pregnant during an affair with her brother-in-law, who is a monk. If you have sex with your brother-in-law, you get the death penalty, okay? Both of them, right? She dies after taking a mixture of cicada or wetches, that's one of the insects I showed you, musk and hawthorn fruit orally to induce abortion, and then after that, her lover was arrested, confessed, and he was put to death. An adopted daughter-in-law, Tong Yangxi, becomes pregnant during an affair with a hired laborer. She had not yet consummated her marriage, therefore she's supposed to be a virgin, right? And then she gets pregnant after she has this affair with a hired laborer. She dies after using a vaginal suppository made of borax, camphor, and musk. I don't know about borax, but camphor and musk are both lethal if they're used internally. If you ever use mentholatum, don't put that inside your body. Actually, every year there are cases of infants who end up either very ill or dead because people put mentholatum all over them and they absorb too much of this. It's very dangerous, actually, if used internally. This is musk. Musk comes from the musk deer. It's a secretion from a gland. It's used in perfumes and so on. This is what it looks like as used in traditional Chinese medicine. It's crystalline. Tiny, tiny amounts are used for various purposes, apparently with some therapeutic effect. But if used internally, it's extremely dangerous. Even small amounts can be fatal. Same thing with camphor. Let's see. Again, if we look at cost, which is relevant to availability, these are just 7 examples in which the price and the amount and the specific drugs used were listed clearly in the cases. These prices, to put them in context, 1.5 picos of husk rice, that's an entire year's food supply for one person, okay? So if you're a poor peasant, that's a lot of money, right? 1,500 to 4,500 cash. You see these various prices in cash. The annual wage for a hired laborer, average, was around 3,000 to 5,000 cash during this period. Or taels of silver, around 5 to 7 taels of silver. So again, if you're rich, that wouldn't be much. But if you're an ordinary person, these are very significant sums of money. Right? And again, so if you're claiming that these drugs were used as part of an ordinary regime of birth control by ordinary peasants, that's hard to explain, I would say. Again, for comparison, these are He's put the prices in context. Cost and availability. So the first one's a case of a pregnant widow who died after paying a midwife this huge amount of rice for an abortifacient suppository of musk and oxney grass, and she died very quickly after inserting this in her vagina. And then the case of a widow who had money, but she searched in vain for means to abort, and then she ended up carrying her pregnancy to term, and then when the birth exposed this, her in-laws killed her lover, and then she was arrested and prosecuted, she was beaten. One of the things you find in these cases of the women attempting abortion in legal cases, it usually is not just about shame, right, or losing face, or worrying about chastity. In these cases, I think basically all the ones I found, you can find other factors that raise the stakes for the people involved. So notice widows here. If a widow maintained her reputation for chastity, she did not remarry, she did not have sex with anybody else, she lived a orderly, proper life according to the norms of the time, then she had a great deal of power. She had the authority to have custody over her husband's children and raise them. She had, if there were no children, she had the authority to choose a nephew to succeed her and continue her husband's family line. She had the authority to manage his property and estate with a high degree of autonomy. And she was protected by custom and law against in-laws meddling, trying to take her property, etc., trying to kick her out. And there was a lot of tension around young widows. Women who were still of reproductive age were seen as being attractive, who claimed to be chaste. And there was a whole lot of litigation. And typically it's in-laws who basically want control of the property and children. They want this young woman to get out and remarry because they think that she's potentially a source of trouble and she's in the way. Versus the young widow who claims to be chaste and to be protecting the patriarchal values of her father, of her husband, and the continuing family line. And these greedy, evil in-laws are oppressing her and trying to, right? So you get all this rhetoric about family values. And often what it really is about is the widow wants her independence. She wants custody of her children. She wants to stay autonomous, right? And the in-laws actually want all that stuff. And they want to get rid of her. But it's all dressed up in terms of rhetoric. But the stakes were very high because a widow who was not chaste, who was caught committing adultery, she would lose everything. She was custody of her children, was custody of her husband's estate, and her in-laws could sell her off to the highest bidder in marriage. That was legal, right? So for these women, the stakes are very, very high. And then in some of these cases, the widow is having an affair with a hired laborer, or she's having an affair with some relative of her husband's, like a brother-in-law, right? Well, those are death penalty cases. If a hired laborer, male, has sex with a woman of his master's household, which would apply here, then the penalty is death by beheading. And if you have, it was defined as incest, sex with your brother-in-law, or marry your brother-in-law, which also happened in some places, that also was a death penalty crime. And so you have these scenarios in which the stakes are dramatically raised beyond just ordinary concern about reputation and face and chastity. They're very material and real stakes involved. I have also cases of like a Buddhist nun who has an affair with a monk and then she gets pregnant. Well, what the stakes there are, first of all, they would both be stripped of their clerical status, which means they lose their livelihood and they're sort of kicked out of society. And second, the penalties for adultery were much higher for clergy, who were supposed to be celibate, than they were for ordinary people. So, I mean, if you look at the actual scenarios in these cases, you get the strong sense that there were specific reasons why people were willing to take the risk involved in attempting abortion in this manner. It wasn't just their reputation. Right? It was that, you know, in some cases their lives were at stake, quite literally. All right, and then there are many cases of pregnancy period to term, which serves as a control set, cases of infanticide. So again, I'm aware that there are very significant sampling bias problems with legal cases. Okay, maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But I am very much aware of that. I think that my argument is actually quite conservative. What I believe is that the evidence that exists does not support the theories that have been advanced by those scholars, which were quite revisionist, radical arguments in their own way. And I have come up with new evidence that they have not looked at, and it suggests an alternative interpretation. I believe that at very least, any theory about these matters should be able to explain the evidence I've found. That's my position. And I would be happy to see other evidence if anyone can produce it. This is the best I've been able to do. Finally, so I see this as a conservative argument. Right? being faithful to the primary evidence. This is what I already said, but this is basically what I think is the reality. They were unreliable, dangerous, usually required specialist knowledge, also significant money. So in the cases, the women all have to buy the drugs from someone. Usually they get the boyfriend to go buy the drugs from someone. So I already said this. Now then the final piece. So as I mentioned, I believe that if these scholars are right about the abortifacients being available before 1949, then they should still be around. So what is the status of these things in the era since 1949? First of all, there's no evidence of traditional Chinese medicine being used for clinical abortion on any kind of wide scale. It's true that there have been some substances have been tested in safe clinical and laboratory settings. The results have been poor, and basically the reason they seem to be so poor, although is that the reason they seem to be so poor is that the way these traditional abortifacients worked is seen in red here. You know, if a woman who's pregnant poisons herself, she may well have a miscarriage, right? And if she's lucky, she may survive. However, she may also die, right? Or become extremely ill. And it seems that the efficacy of these things, when they worked, was based on this kind of effect. Basically, miscarriage as a side effect of poisoning. And so the people who've tested these things in safe clinical settings either found that they were completely spurious, didn't work at all, or that they were too dangerous really to continue doing this work. Right? And so, yes, medical abortion is widely used in China today. They use mifepristone, which is the same thing that's used here, as far as I know. And it has it's very, very safe, and has a very, very high rate of effectiveness. It's inexpensive. So there's no evidence that these traditional substances are used. There was an interesting study that was done in the 50s when there was this new enthusiasm about traditional Chinese medicine. Lots of laboratory tests of different substances were being used. Many of them were found to have value. I mean, many traditional Chinese medicine drugs do have great therapeutic value. I'm not dismissing the whole field by any means. But for example, in Shanghai, prostitutes back in the Republican period and the Qing, they would swallow tadpoles regularly. This was seen as a way to avoid pregnancy or to induce an early abortion. And there were claims that it worked. And so they tested this in the 50s, and they had to abandon the study after like 3 months because it turns out all the women were getting pregnant. And then people realized that, well, you know, you're talking about prostitutes in Shanghai. Well, in the 1930s, the rates of syphilis infection, there were no antibiotics, they were estimated like 50% among prostitutes. Well, syphilis and chlamydia and gonorrhea will all cause female infertility if they're not treated. Right? And so you have to assume that the rates of infertility among these prostitutes were very, very high. And so any kind of contraceptive effect that was perceived was probably due to infertility rather than to tadpoles. And also, taking tadpoles is not really safe because you get parasites and all sorts of nasty things like that. So that was what I was hoping to find out, but what I did not expect, and which really surprised me, but also is kind of interesting, is that these unsafe techniques persist. And I don't have statistics on this, but I did these online searches. There are these online databases of China academic journals, and they include medical journals, they include journals about traditional Chinese medicine, journals about forensic pathology, and so on. And you can do these keyword searches for keywords in the titles of articles. And I found all these reports from the Mao era, but also the post-Mao era, of large numbers of women who were using these traditional abortifacients for unsafe abortion. They were ending up either dead or in emergency rooms as a result. And this just was astonishing to me because, you know, abortion is legal, it's widely available, it's safe, in many places it's free. So how do you explain this? Well, if you look at the examples, so here I have two examples. These are two cases from Hubei from 1990. An unmarried woman aged 21, 7 months pregnant, drank wine infused with powdered molasses beetles, she died the next day. Number two, an unmarried woman, you get the theme here, right? Age 22, 4 months pregnant, swallowed 6 Malabras carcasses, also applied plasters made with Malabras to her temples and abdomen. She died the next day. This is what these things look like. They are the same as the legal cases. It's all pregnancy caused by adultery, right? Or extramarital sex. And so there's this bizarre kind of deja vu feeling reading these modern cases, where it's just like reading the 18th century legal cases. the context is the same. And these tend to be young rural women who are not married, who get pregnant, and then, yes, safe and legal abortion is available at the local clinic, but if you go to the clinic, everybody knows you went to the clinic, right? And so they cannot risk the exposure of their sex life that this would entail, and therefore they end up resorting to these, these sort of folk remedies that they know about that are available in the community. They can get from a midwife, or they can get from something like that. And so again, I don't have statistics. This is not the sort of thing I think the Chinese government really likes to count, but I have reports from all over the country for the last few decades. And the common theme is young single women who fear exposure of their sexual history. Therefore, they take the risk involved in this. Again, I can elaborate on these things if you like. And malabris, the beetles, the insects are not the only culprit. There are a lot of toxic herbs that we use as well.
But if I could just interject,
Of
it does
course.
seem like shame is an element, though,
It does,
in this.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's it. It's anyway, again, in the kinds of reports that I've been able to get in these journals, they don't really go into the psychological state of the woman or what people in the community said. You just have the sort of stark facts of the case.
But what are the practical consequences if you're an unmarried woman in 1990 who becomes pregnant? I mean, there are some material consequences, not just some community disapproval. I mean, you're not going to probably be promoted in your job if you're allowed to keep your job.
Yeah. And so again, I think you're right. I think, though, it's very hard given the lack of information in those medical cases, because these are like little articles in these journals that I find online. You don't have the exact scenario. You don't know the family relations or the exact situation of the woman. Is she engaged to somebody else? I mean, it's just not clear. So without that, and that's the sort of thing you do get in the legal cases, but without that, it's very hard to put these individual cases into specific context. And I'm not arguing that this happens all the time. And it may be happening less now than it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The thing that's shocking is it happens at all, to me. And that it seemed that you could find examples from all over China. It's not just one province or one county. Another scenario, which I found reported sort of indirectly, I found a report from Pingguo County in Guangxi. It was a report about basically maternal mortality in this county over a 3-year period, 89 to 91. And it was giving the cost of maternal mortality in the context of an effort to reduce that and to improve safety around pregnancy and childbirth. And what it said is that 5 of 31 deaths related to pregnancy or childbirth resulted from hemorrhage or infection in rural women who, quote, used herbal drugs to induce abortion on their own. Again, it doesn't give the context. Why? Why did these specific women do it? I mean, one thing that's going on, which is not related to abortion per se, but during the most draconian period of the one-child-only policy, with the 1.5-child-only policy in the countryside, women who were under pressure from their families to have extra children outside the plan, as they would say, would do so in secret. They do it at home without any attendant and so on. And in that context, childbirth can be very dangerous, right? You have nobody attending and no resort to medical care. That kind of thing was going on. And those would be reported in these journals as these stupid, ignorant peasants. Why on earth do they take the risk of doing this? The context is they are under enormous family pressure to have extra children beyond the one they've been allowed. But again, so these stories are kind of opaque. They're kind of opaque. I don't know what all went on in these cases. What shocked me is that I found so many of them, and they didn't seem to be random. They all seemed to fit the basic pattern. So again, I basically stopped there. As you can probably tell, I'm a big fan of modernity. I think that things like modern dentistry and antibiotics and anesthesia, these are wonderful things. I'm glad I live when I do, but I think especially safe and effective and widely available contraception and abortion are also great benefits of modernity. But the fact is, they're not evenly shared, like other benefits of modernity. They're not evenly shared. And there are plenty of places where either there's stigma or prohibition or whatever, women don't have access to those. And so in the world, in various parts of the world today, including apparently in China sometimes, you find women resorting to these folk methods, very dangerous methods, toxic herbs of one kind or another, self-injury, and so on, in order to try to induce abortion. And so there is a very significant mortality rate around the world caused by these kinds of things. So what does this have to do with feminist historical research, which is the theme I began with? So the gender historians are definitely feminists, there's no question. The demographic historians, I don't know what to call them, but the gender historians are definitely feminists. There's no question about that. But it seems to me that their scholarship has been guided by a desire to discover a degree of agency and autonomy in at least some women in the late imperial period. And these are always the elite wives who are literate and about whom we know the most. And I think that unconsciously these scholars tend to identify with the elite wife. They never identify with the concubines and maidservants. I don't know why, but they never do. I'm right, right?
I started my book with Ning Feng.
Well, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking.
That's right.
You're off the hook.
But you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
When you read these people, they always identify with the elite
Susan
wife.
Man and
You
Dorothy
know, they
Coe,
always
and
do.
they channel these women.
And it seems to me that this argument, what it comes down to is a desire to believe that these women enjoyed something which I see as definitively modern. The ability to use technology, safe and reliable technology, to have a sex life which is independent from getting pregnant, which is independent from giving birth, and in a sense to liberate your sex life from reproduction. And I see that as a definitively modern condition, the ability to do that in any kind of systematic, reliable way. And it seems to me that what they want to do is project that back to the past and find women who enjoyed that condition.
Hence the Shun De research too, right?
Say it again?
The Shun De of these female same-sex couples.
Well, yeah.
That was a kind of research kind of boom for a little while.
Yes. The idea there were women who avoided marriage and then were able to have lesbian relations and all. And there's probably some truth to that, but there are also reasons for skepticism about some of it. But it seems to me that the historians I'm talking about, they're guided by kind of wishful thinking. And if you look at the sources they cite, in some cases I found systematic mistranslations. I don't want to get too technical here, but in classical Chinese, the pronouns are gender neutral, and also if context is understood, no pronoun will be used at all. And I found that Charlotte Firth in particular, in translating a couple of important passages, she had systematically assumed the subject of action to be female, when if you read the larger text, it was very clear that the subject of action was male. It was the husband of the woman in question. It was not the woman. And with that, the whole argument about that passage collapsed. and you know, I don't believe this was done on purpose. I don't entirely know why it was done, but I think that, well, I don't understand a feminism which is based on trying to celebrate things in the past, and I think there was really nothing to celebrate. I don't understand a feminism which seeks to find in the past a model for the ways things should be. For me, the whole point of feminism is that we're creating something better now than existed in the past. And I think the past really pretty much sucked for most people most of the time. That's what I believe. And I'm a big fan of modernity, especially with regard to these issues I'm talking about today. And this is not merely an academic matter, I think, because as I'm sure you all know, yes, we enjoy safe and reliable contraception and abortion, but there are people who would like to take those things away from us, right? And I think that being complacent about traditional techniques that existed in the past, before Roe versus Wade, etc., is dangerous. Dangerous insofar as it induces any kind of complacency about these matters, because I think that there are good reasons why we needed the pill and Roe versus Wade and effective condoms and things like that. And I think it's great that people's sex lives can be liberated from reproduction. I think that's a wonderful thing. If those things were taken away, we'd be back to women douching with bleach and lye. In the early 20th century, upwards of 20,000 women a year died in the United States from unsafe abortion. Those rates went down once antibiotics came in, but I see no reason to glamorize the past. And I think the danger of these friends of mine, they may not think I'm their friend anymore, but I can see my friends. The danger of the line of argument that these friends of mine have advanced is not only that I think the evidence is not supported, but also that it could conceivably induce a kind of complacency about these matters. Anyway, so I'll stop there. But
all right, well, thank you for a terrific presentation. Let's open it up for questions.
I may be completely off because my Chinese history is very weak, but is there any spiritual element involved in this, like these techniques used in abortion? Because in
spiritual element?
Yeah, like in India, in some areas when they're trying to sell herbs or any of that stuff, they tried to link it to some like god or some other bigger power. Yeah.
Well, there were, I mean, among the various ways of trying to induce abortion, there were prayer. If you've read Shen Congwen's story or seen the movie Girl from Hunan, Xianyu Xiaoxiao, maybe you've seen it. When she gets pregnant, and she's unmarried, she first tries to drink cold water. That doesn't work. Then she goes to a Buddhist temple, she prays to Guanyin, the Bodhisattva, and then she swallows a handful of incense ashes. That doesn't work either. But so there is this religious aspect. As far as the drugs themselves are concerned, I don't know of any religious aspect to how they were prepared and used.
Okay.
I haven't seen that in the cases that I have. There was, I mean, the demographic historians who argue that there was no disapproval of infanticide. It's kind of a staggering claim, which is can be readily disproved. There was over 1,000 years of Buddhist discourse in China against infanticide, and there were a lot of Buddhist people in China. So the idea that the Chinese never disapproved of infanticide is preposterous. I mean, religion did play an important role in how people understood these matters.
But your talk yesterday about polyandry suggests that even though there's 1,000 years of discourse against it, it might be perfectly accepted.
Well, that's true. It's possible.
Because I was interested to hear you say a little bit more about the infanticide, because I know there's been recent work on it in Chinese history, but I'm more familiar with the older stuff on Japanese history, where they say that, Japanese actually did believe at some point the person became a person, the fetus became a person, but not immediately. And I was curious about what people think these days about the Chinese ideas about it.
Well, so there's a lot of evidence that that's true in Japan from the Tokugawa period, especially the 18th century. There's a very startling fact. Japan, for the early modern era, has fantastic demographic data. It's very unusual around the world for the high quality demographic data. And in the 18th century, for much of the 18th century, the population growth was flat. And it's very hard to explain that without some kind of active human intervention. And then there's a lot of evidence. Fabian Drixler at Yale has published an amazing book. A lot of evidence that infanticide was being systematically used by ordinary people in Japan to control family size. However, it was not necessarily only girls. Girls were more valued than in China, and so it did not lead to the extreme sex ratio imbalances that we saw in China. Was that true in China as well? I haven't seen any evidence to convince me that it was. Now, infanticide existed in China, there's no question. The evidence that I've seen suggests it was done under circumstances of extraordinary pressure. Usually it took the form of exposure, abandonment, rather than active killing. It was on circumstances of famine, for example.
And you can see, just the point you made yesterday about the huge traffic in women, that there were alternatives, right?
Yeah. Well, so in Taiwan, for example, Arthur Wolff, because of the Japanese occupation, has amazing demographic data going back into the 19th century. Arthur Wolff, the great anthropologist who passed away a couple of years ago, used this to measure all sorts of things, marriage practices. There was a kind of marriage practice that was common throughout China, but in some parts of Taiwan it was actually the majority practice. It was the adopted daughter-in-law, the Tongyangxi. And what would often happen is that if two women in a village gave birth to daughters, they would swap them. And so you raise this infant from the breast, you raise this infant as your daughter-in-law instead of as your daughter. In places where the rate of that kind of marriage was high, there was essentially no infanticide. Because you could always give away a daughter. There was no reason to abandon her or kill her. You would always give away a daughter. Someone would want to raise an adopted daughter-in-law.
For those of you who read the Daughter of Han, you'll notice that there was a market for little girls. Mrs. Ning's husband sold her daughter, right?
My sense, again, I'm talking to a different set of demographers, those Mark Feldman at Stanford and others. If you look, like even now in rural areas, there's excess female mortality in every age cohort. If you look at the census from 2000, also I think the 2010 one, the sex ratios actually get worse between ages 1 and 4. So what that means is that something's happening to little girls after they're born. It's not infanticide. It's discrimination, it's neglect, it's relative nutrition, it's relative health care. And those can all be sort of on a micro level in any individual case, but in the aggregate, you add them all up, you have these skewed sex ratios. I suspect that's the bigger story. It probably has been for a long time. Out and out infanticide, I think, was a pretty extreme thing to do in any society, and I think in China, yes, it did happen, but it was under extreme circumstances. So in these cases where these women, widows usually, would carry a pregnancy to term that was inconvenient, they would attempt infanticide, or they would do infanticide, or they'd be discovered anyway. Well, that's a pretty extreme situation. They're desperate to conceal this childbirth. I mean, I've read thousands of these legal cases, and they talk about all sorts of aspects of people's lives. I've never seen any evidence that infanticide was used in a kind of systematic or casual way, routine way for family planning in China. I accept the argument about Japan, but I just haven't seen any evidence to support that for China. But James Lee claims this, of course. James Lee and Wong and people don't claim this. I've seen no qualitative evidence to support it. But again, accounting for the sex ratio, the data for pre-modern China is so weak that if you just have numbers, I don't know. But anyway, that's my understanding of infanticide.
Is there a lot of interest in China in this kind of history? There is a pretty lively feminist movement, and Joe knows something about that in China, but I don't know if it takes a scholarly historical direction at all, to try to understand.
Well, there's a lot of work being done in contemporary society, and some of that's really good. Chung, you were talking about a text yesterday.
The suicide?
Right. So I was, for a while, I was involved in a project with a research Institute for Population and Development Studies at Xi'an Jiaotong University. And they have some really good people. They're all basically social scientists. And they've done a lot of social surveys. And they're very interested in the female deficit, is the term they use, the female deficit issue, the sex ratio issue, and trying to devise policies to ameliorate that, incentives and so on for people to value daughters and so on. And they've done, extensive surveys. They've got a lot of interesting information about these practices. What struck me, though, when I spent a month as a visiting scholar there, is they really didn't know about anything that happened prior to maybe 1990. They had no sense of history at all. They didn't know anything. They were astonished when I talked about these things. They had no idea there were sex ratio imbalances in the Republican period. It's kind of astonishing. These sophisticated people with PhDs, so well informed about contemporary circumstances, and I'm not saying that everyone in China is like that, but this set of very sophisticated social scientists, they were completely clueless about history. And I think it was kind of, in some ways they had underestimated the difficulty of solving these problems because they didn't realize how long-standing they were, how they'd survived so many other big changes. Chung, did you want to?
Oh, yes. I was thinking about your idea mentioned in the paper about rural women's suicide.
Yeah.
So when I was doing my field work in countryside, I interviewed lots of peasants. Most of them are my relatives. So they talked to me. There were so many rural young women, 20s, between 20 and 30s. They committed suicide.
Right.
But yes, I read a book written by a scholar in Renmin University, but I think your argument definitely challenged his argument because he said most of the women's suicide is because they want to seeking justice, use their life as kind of a protest to their mother-in-law's family.
Yeah,
but pregnancy, yes, adultery, pregnancy caused by adultery probably can be a reason. But the thing is, that scholar also mentioned it was so difficult to do interviews with the dead woman's
Who wants to
families.
talk about such things?
Right. And also,
So in the Qing legal case, there are lots of cases of female suicide under different circumstances. There's one I talk about in that paper where it's a widow who became pregnant and she committed suicide, supposedly. Well, but the drug she took to commit suicide was also known to be an abortifacient. So I think probably she was trying to induce abortion and she died. And then the family, for whatever reason, either they didn't understand that it was an abortion attempt or it was just represented this way. And female suicide, especially these young women, probably the same kind who end up in the ER, within my scenarios. They're dying, and the most common way of committing suicide is by drinking pesticide or some other toxic. Well, that's the kind of thing they would do in the Qing too, when they were trying to induce abortion. And so, speculating, I think it's possible that some of this suicide statistic within that is hidden a much smaller percentage of women trying to induce abortion will die, and then it's either covered up or people don't know. But again, that's probably impossible to measure. But I think it's plausible that would be hidden within the larger statistic.
I have one other question. So what happened to the children in the Qing dynasty? I mean, their parents, his mom or her mom probably were sentenced to death. And
What happened to children?
yeah,
Well, children belong with their father, and by extension with whoever's the head of the father's household. So the closest senior male relative would have custody. So the children stay with their lineage, right?
no, I mean the woman who had adultery with the outside men,
Right.
and then she could not.
If she gives birth?
Yes.
Oh, well, again, children belong with their father. So if this is from adultery, they go with the father.
The father
If
of
he's
the
dead, it goes with the senior male relative of his lineage.
her boyfriend or her husband.
The boyfriend, not the husband, no. The jianshanzi,
Oh, I
child
see.
born of adultery, stays with the father, is to be excluded from the bloodlines of the woman's husband or the woman's father.
So he could not be recorded in the family tree or
No,
no. Okay.
absolutely not. But yeah, but that's a very important principle because the idea was to keep bloodlines pure. Right? So if a woman has adultery, if she's unmarried, then you want to exclude this child from the lineage of her father. If she's married, you want to exclude this child from the lineage of her husband. Right? So that child goes with the adulterer or his family. You look unhappy.
No. I see, yeah.
Did you want to?
Yeah. Is there like stigma carried with the child then, the child of adultery as they grow up? That
I assume so, but I don't know.
Okay.
But I would assume so, yeah.
I found the historiographic aspects of your talk fascinating. I mean, you're every historian's nightmare, in a sense. You go into the archive and you look at those primary sources yourself rather than relying on secondary criticism and all that. I'm just interested, you don't have to get too personal or anything, but have you been on a panel with Firth and Bray? How have they responded to your
It's very interesting.
work?
So none of the people whose work I challenged have responded in any way.
Wow.
And I suppose there are two ways to interpret that. One is that I won. They've got nothing to say. But I think also there's a technique, especially in a small field, of you simply ignore something that's inconvenient. And I think that's what's going on. And they all just simply ignore it.
But also, Charlotte Firth just published her memoir. I think she spent a lot of time where she went to China in 1980 and lived there for a couple of years. And it's a very early period for Americans, and she has a lot of interesting stories to tell. So she just published her memoir.
So she's been busy doing other
She
things.
has been.
I've heard indirectly that Francisca Bray is pretty unhappy with me. But honestly, maybe I'm naive, but honestly, the more I got into this, the more interested I became, and also the more important it seemed to me. Maybe
So the best way to respond for you students out here, if somebody like him shows up and tears apart your work, you say, "Oh, I'm so glad you did that because I put this out there to get feedback, and you have made a very convincing case." And you gotta thank him and embrace him. So that's your.
So what I was expecting was a debate. I was really expecting a debate. I was hoping for that. I thought it'd be really interesting. Also, I was willing to be shown to be wrong. If there's more evidence, please show me. Let's study this topic. It deserves more research. Honestly, that was my attitude going into this. I mean, I was pretty sure I was right, but I was willing to be challenged. Like I said, my basic position here is pretty conservative, kind of old school.
You're not going to publish a book on it.
Well, I thought about it for a while. The article is pretty long. There's a lot more material that I could add, and conceivably it could be a short book. But I don't know. I'm not sure what the point would be. The article's available. Anyone
Well,
who's
then they'll
interested.
review it.
Well,
So that's a debate. I mean, because people don't review articles, right?
that's true. That's true. Articles are easier to ignore than books. But so, for example, I talked a little bit about the novel Jinping Mei, which has two interesting abortion episodes, one for each kind of crisis I talk about.
Did Xi Jinping, did he die because he took that?
That was an aphrodisiac. He died of overdose of
Right.
aphrodisiac. Yeah. Well,
Very
and I
dramatic.
was really wondering whether it was Spanish fly, but it never says. It never gives a recipe. But you know, his
But the
symptoms
symptoms are definitely there.
Yeah, that's right. The symptoms are definitely there. But one of the interesting things is that So one of the abortions is Wu Yuanyang, who's the main wife in this crazy polygynous family in this famous novel. And she's a very sympathetic character. She's like the only nice person in the whole novel. And she gets pregnant. So one of the themes here is that all the women in this family, they want to get pregnant. They want to bear a son for the husband.
Did you see Raise the Red Lantern, that movie?
And so all the
Sort of like
politics among the women
Yeah.
are about who's going to get pregnant, who's going to have a son, and their status in the family will improve, and et cetera, et cetera. So she is longing to get pregnant. So she finally does get pregnant, but then she falls down, injures herself, and she's ill. And so a midwife gives her a drug to induce abortion because she's believed to have her life in danger. And then she does succeed in aborting safely, and it's a boy. And so the logic here is the kind of the karmic thing, where they all want to get pregnant and have a son, but it's just impossible for them to do so. And every time someone gets pregnant, something goes wrong. And of
So
course
this is relevant to your question, the karmic retribution.
Oh yeah, so it's all about karmic retribution. And so the second abortion, it's after the husband has died, and his concubine, the notorious Pan Jinlian, she is having an affair with his son-in-law, so it's incest, right? And they're having an affair. She gets pregnant. And again, she had longed to get pregnant with her husband, but now that she finally is pregnant, this is extremely dangerous because it's going to expose what she's been doing. So she has her boyfriend approach this doctor to get a drug. And what's interesting is the novel, it lays out the entire recipe for the drug. And it's like a laundry list of all the most dangerous things I talked about. And if you actually took this thing, you would die. And it seems to me in fitting with kind of black humor of the novel. The author of the novel may have known that. And so listen, and so again, she doesn't die, but she aborts, and it's a boy. So one more piece of karmic retribution. Later on, she gets killed gruesomely by somebody else. But it's fascinating that the author lays out in such detail the recipe for this abortive fashion. This is a 16th century novel, but it's pretty clear that this author had a copy of Bansal Gangmu or something like that, kind of went through them down and said, which are the worst of these things? Let's put them in the... because this woman who induces abortion, she's this notorious kind of bad wife, has an affair, murders her husband, becomes the concubine of the man she had an affair with, is always scheming, kind of the epitome in Chinese culture of the bad woman, right? The Pan Jinlian, the Jianfu, right?
Who's a necessary foil for the chaste woman.
Absolutely,
Right,
absolutely. I mean, there is a kind of contrary feminist reading of this, but I think that's probably valid now. I think at the time in the 16th century, she was not supposed to be sympathetic.
Were there cases where the couple runs away after committing the adultery instead of like taking the abortion drugs and then?
Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of cases of couples run away.
That seems more safer option.
I don't know necessarily if they were pregnant when they did it, but yeah, there are lots of cases of people eloping, running away, and so on. And sometimes they get caught.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We find out about them because they get caught, right?
What's that?
We
Yeah, well,
find
that's
out
right.
about them because they get
Yeah.
caught. There's a very famous book by the historian Jonathan Spence called Death of Woman Wong,
Wong.
which involves a couple that are having an affair and run away, and it doesn't really work out.
The boyfriend dumps her, basically. She has to go home, and her husband murders her.
Oh,
It's a pretty sad story. Yes.
So I don't know, like, so you mentioned that so elite women, they will like to pass down the duty of pregnancy to those concubines.
Well, that's
and
the argument. That's the
yeah,
argument. Yeah.
and I don't know, like, but after the father died,
Mhm.
so those children by the concubines, they would share those possessions by both the father and their legal mother. I don't know if that the legal mother, the real mother, they would like to agree that those children that were not born by her to share them.
So you're talking about inheritance?
Yeah.
Well, by law and custom, they were supposed to. The sons, Zhuzi, Junfeng, all sons share equally in the father's estate. And sons of concubines were legitimate and inherited equally. Now, of course, between the women, there might be rivalry. There was a kind of politics of the elite household, which this novel we were talking about portrays in a very exaggerated, lurid form. But there's a risk in reading novels like Jinping Mei and imagining that that's what life was really like. I mean, it's sort of like watching a soap opera in the morning.
But actually, to go with Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Meng, I think the most poignant part about that is the relationship of Tan Chun with her mother, because Tan Chun is the daughter of a concubine and she disses her, basically. She doesn't respect her mother because she's been raised as the daughter of the house, as a lady, and her mother is a concubine, you know. So, and
So that's
Tan Chun
what
is actually the most sympathetic character in the whole book. But then there's this aspect of it that's why I think it's poignant.
So you get this bizarre situation where you have like a class difference between the daughter and her own mother.
Exactly.
Right? Because she's been raised the daughter of an elite household, but her mother was some probably poor peasant, illiterate, bought from her parents, basically bought to be a breeding cow, right?
For the poor peasants that were like bought as concubines, was that considered like a socially upward mobile
for
move
sure.
for them? Okay.
Yeah, so when parents sold a daughter like that, it doesn't mean they necessarily didn't love their daughter. On the contrary, this was upward mobility. I mean, she would get 3 squares a day and not have to worry about her old age, as long as she behaved herself.
There's a fantastic novel I have to recommend by Li Jieren. It's called, there's an English translation, it's called Ripples Across Stagnant Water. It was written in the 1930s, and the main character is this very strong woman. Li Jieren studied in France, so he read a lot of French literature and imbibed a lot of stuff about women's roles, but again, he also read all these other novels we were talking about. And the main character is this woman who really wants to be a concubine because she wants to live in the city. But her parents say, you know, you're not going to like it being a concubine. We're going to find a nice, honest, you know, upright merchant to marry you to. So they end up marrying her to this kind of very, not the brightest character, but he's very steady, very good moral guy. And then speaking of polyandry, his Gumar becomes her lover. So Gumar is like his buddy, his close buddy, who's a very powerful character. He's actually the head of a Gulahui branch, so he's a secret society guy. And he treats his friend as his buddy, right? He basically protects him. But then, you know, that he's just married this woman and she's attractive and he falls for her. And, you know, it's got a lot of the dynamics that you talked about yesterday in it. And then there's a prostitute with a heart of gold in it too.
So this is really the stuff of 1950s pulp fiction. I mean, Dreamy Red Chamber. I mean, I can see the book cover now.
Well,
You know,
I think the people who love it call it Story of the Stone.
Yeah,
It has alternative titles.
yeah, story of the stone.
Because it has a framing device where a stone comes down to earth, a kind of he becomes a human being basically, and he's told it's a kind of Buddhist framing story where you're going to experience life in the world of sorrow and bitterness, and then he's born as kind of the hero of this very long novel.
Really interesting. Any other questions or comments? Anything like? Well, thank you so much. This has been
thank you.
fantastic.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us a chance to talk about Chinese.